Our next speaker, Barbara Kline Pope, has what I often describe as kind of a dream job. She works for the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering, and she has for a long time led their publication effort. In fact, she's a kind of a pioneer in the open access movement for scientific publication. But she also is in charge of outreach and public education for the National Academies. And one of the things she's done there is establish a unit whose job it is to find reliable science advisors for major entertainment venues. And in fact, Bones was one of them. So it better have been right, because Barbara helped with that one. So we're going to hear from Barbara about something that I really wanted to ask Bill Nye, and that is, do you really think that participating in major entertainment has a positive impact on science and what it means to the public? That's one of her jobs, and she's here to tell us about it. Barbara?
Hi, everyone. Are we making it through this long period of many talks? Good. So I'm going to talk today about how film and TV really affect our own beliefs and attitudes and public attitudes about science. And that's going to be the first half of this talk. The second half, I'm going to tell you about how the National Academy of Sciences over the last 5 years has been really working to influence the image of science and scientists on screens large and small. And so, as you might expect, I am working for the National Academy of Sciences. I am surrounded by scientists all day, every day, and I'm actually surrounded by them at night too, because I'm married to one. But I'm not a scientist. I'm a communication practitioner, but I use the behavioral and social sciences in most of my work as head of communications for the National Academies. And I really try to make sure that I fill the practice of communication with as much research as we practically can. So I'm also a mom, and believe it or not, I think about social and behavioral sciences a lot when I'm with my kids. Don't tell them that. They'll think I'm a nerd. But at any rate, what I want to start with is sort of an interactive story, at least interactive at the very beginning of it, about social science and my younger son, Edward. So when you see this restaurant, what do you think of? Junk food, chicken, right. How do you pronounce the name of this restaurant? Popeyes. Well, that was pretty easy, right? Even though there aren't any here in Columbia, at least I don't think so. Are there? You've probably seen them in St. Louis or Kansas City. But you've seen commercials, maybe you got something in the mail, so we all know that this restaurant is called Popeyes, and we all think of chicken, or junk food, or negativity. I'm actually from Columbia, Maryland, between Washington and Baltimore. And there are about 100 Popeyes restaurants around us. But, as I heard from some of you, you call this junk food. I didn't let my kids have junk food when they were young, so they didn't know much about Popeyes. And so important to this story is that you meet my son, Edward. It's Edward Pope is his name, and he's 12 years old now. But think of him at this age, sitting in the back of my Ford Explorer, in his booster seat, with his legs swinging, looking out the window. We're driving down, from Columbia to DC, and I'm on New Hampshire Avenue in my car. And suddenly in the back seat, he says, "Hey, Mom, look, that sign says, Pope yes." So Edward has his frame of reference, and you have yours. And, even though we have lots and lots of Popeyes restaurants, he brings his own experience, his own frame of reference. You bring your own experience, your own frame of reference to this. And that is not a new area of psychology, but it's well researched. And obviously now we've figured this out, that Edward brings his last name as a frame of reference to this, rather than chicken or even, the spinach guzzling sailor man. But as we see the same media, get the same information, we all have common frame of reference. And so even Edward now believes that Popeyes has fried chicken. We can apply the same topic, the same concept, really, to science. And I'm going to grab a swig of water here. I'm getting dry. Do you personally know a scientist? I think everybody in this room knows a scientist. But most people don't. 18% of people, when they're asked by Research America if they know a scientist, said yes. And when they ask more granularly about who that scientist was, most of them refer to their family physician. Yeah, and when I talk to the Institute of Medicine about that, they think that's fine. When I talk to the National Academy of Sciences, they smirk like you did. So I happen to know hundreds of scientists, but most people see scientists on film and on TV, and they see them over and over again on film and TV. And so it's really not surprising, I think, that people start to think that what they see on TV and on the movies and if they're watching TV on the internet, that's reality, and that's what scientists are really like. So for instance, if people cumulatively and consistently see quirky white males as scientists on TV, I don't know why anybody would be surprised to know that people think that in reality they are quirky, white, and male. And these images become really ingrained in people's minds, and we know that because we all watch movies, we go to watch TV. And it gets really ingrained, and it starts to affect yours and other people's beliefs and attitudes about science, and it's really powerful. And in the communication science literature, that watching lots of TV and forming attitudes based on that is called cultivation. And cultivation was a term coined by George Gerber very early, I think in the 60s. And George Gerber was a pretty cool person as far as I can tell. I've never met him. Has anybody in here met George Gerber? Not even Dominic? Okay. So George Gerber was born in 1919 in Hungary. He was a poet. He fled Hungary because he didn't want to be drafted into the army there. And he came to the US and met up with his filmmaker brother. He had a kind of a tough time getting into the US. He spent a lot of time in Cuba and Mexico before they let him in. But once he was here in the US, he ended up getting a journalism degree. He was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. And then, ironically, he joined the US Army and became a paratrooper. And he parachuted in World War II down into Austria, right near his home country of Hungary. And he stayed there until the war was over, and fast forward, he came back, he got a PhD, and he became the dean of the School for Communication of Annenberg at Penn from 1964 to 1989. So he really changed, what he was doing as he went along in his life. And what his research showed was that over time, our media experiences are experienced really cumulatively. And that as these images are more and more ingrained, they cultivate new perceived realities and new, particularly ingrained worldviews. And so most of his work was done on TV and violence. So he did a lot of research on that. But it's his work on the effects on public attitudes on TV with scientists is what we really are interested in talking about today. So he studied TV shows from 1973 to 1983. And at that point in time, the scientific community, as well as many other people, really thought that there were more negative portrayals of scientists in TV than positive ones. And that's what he thought he would find. But he didn't. But what he did find is that compared to other professions, the proportion of good to bad for scientists was worse. So for example, we see here that in the 10 years of content analysis that he did, that for every one evil law enforcement professional, there were 40 who were heroes. And for every one physician, for every one TV show doctor, that was bad. 19 of them were good. But for every one scientist who was a villain, 5 of them were virtuous, only 5. So it was a real disconnect really between the proportions. And you can see this more when I show it this way. I also want to say that Dominic Broussard and her graduate student Anthony Dudo did research and did content analysis from the year 2000 to 2008. And what they found, and I'll go over in a little bit some of the similarities in their research. One of the differences is that in these proportions, they did find that scientists and doctors were more proportionally good to bad. So things were getting better as we moved from 73 to 83 to the later decade. What both Dudo and Gerber found in their research, however, was that scientists were grossly underrepresented in TV shows, with only 1% of the fictional characters in a TV show, or in all the TV shows they looked at, being scientists. One of the positive things we found is that if a scientist could actually make it on a screen, a fictional scientist, was that sometimes, and actually oftentimes, they were portrayed as strong and, as you might expect, pretty smart. Now that flies in the face of this next conclusion that Gerber found, and Dudo also as well, and that is that scientists were much more likely than other professions to kill others or to be murdered themselves. So we can see here that the scientist, my laser pointer's not working. Well, anyway, so the scientist on the left, is 5% of the scientists in these TV shows were likely to murder others, and doctors only 1.5%. And the scientists likely to kill were 10% of the scientists on screen, with only 2% of doctors doing that terrible act. And so what Dudo and Gerber both stated in their research in their papers was that being a scientist is one of the most dangerous and violent professions that you could ever undertake. And you and I, because we all know scientists, we know that's not true. But really, where does that leave everybody else? So for fun now, what I want to do is show you a 2-minute video of portrayals of scientists in movies. And this was put together by our friend Jerry Zucker in Hollywood. He's a writer, director, producer. I'll talk more about him a little bit later. This is a non-random, convenient sample meant to be fun.
It's alive! In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
I'm working on something that'll change the world and human life as we know it.
This will be the greatest breakthrough in the history of science.
Revolutionize a human map.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
40,000 years of evolution, and we barely even tapped the vastness of human potential.
I gave him life.
Are you using a polymer-based neural relay to transmit the organic nerve impulses to the central processor of my positronic net?
I've remodulated the pulse emitters.
I'm talking about the reticular activating system.
Single faulty enzyme in protein metabolism.
The retinal aperture dilation.
Interplexing beacon.
Hydroponics, stellar cartography, deflector control.
Human teleportation.
Mutant antibody.
Testing D-phase protocol. Serial irradiated protein Kane 125.
Mutated the dinosaur genetic code. Blended it with that of frogs.
An invisible being that cannot be disintegrated by atomic fission.
I've caught
conquered brain death.
Unless there's an arterial venous fistula.
Bioelectric energy and quantum shift indicators are stable.
The sleep hormones acted as a catalyst in some kind of metabolic reaction and then were expelled as waste.
What about the lysine contingency? We could put that into effect.
He postulated that cognitive simulacra might one day approximate component models of the psyche.
There is enough energy in this glass of water to power the city of Chicago for weeks.
You can't be serious.
The signal has a definite sequential pattern, so as soon as I find the exact binary sequence, then I calculate the phase reversal with that analyzer. And what you're doing here, genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a molecular decimation, breakdown, and reformation is...
Yes, sir.
The Earth has aged nearly 700 years since we left it. Well, we've aged hardly at all.
Anyway, so that was for fun. So importantly, you know, this was for fun. Not everybody was negative in there. There was a decent number of women in that series of clips. But what Gerber found was that heavy viewers of TV ended up actually having negative views of science, and that's really a pretty important piece of this. And so he basically said to himself, okay, what to do? So in 1987, he wrote an article based on his research in Issues in Science and Technology called Science on TV. And this actually is a magazine that we publish at the National Academy of Sciences. And what he said was that television's portrayal of science deserves more focused attention by the scientific community. He was basically giving the scientific community a real call to action. What he wanted the scientific community to do is to make more realistic information and images not only available but inescapable to those in the entertainment community. But it wasn't until November of 2008, more than 20 years after he made this call to action, that his call was actually answered. And that was when the National Academy of Sciences started the Science and Entertainment Exchange. And this is a program designed to bring more realistic science and more positive portrayals of science to film and TV. And you'll notice that I don't say the word accurate science, because when you say accurate science, they believe that you're going to make them use that, whether it's going to trump their story or not. So for us to be able to actually get into Hollywood, we have to make sure we're saying it's more realistic. And it ends up being almost accurate, or accurate anyway. So the Science and Entertainment Exchange was started in the living room of Janet and Jerry Zucker. Jerry Zucker was the one who did those nice clips for us. You might also know him. They're both writers, directors, and producers in Hollywood. You might know him by his movie Airplane, which I will now admit that is my favorite movie of all time. They knew Ralph Cicerone, who's the current president of the National Academy of Sciences, when Ralph Cicerone was the chancellor of UC Irvine. It was a time when Janet and Jerry were really getting interested in science because their daughter Katie has juvenile diabetes. Very interested in stem cell research. And they even helped to pass Proposition 71 in California. You can see this is Jerry Zucker here in the back with Brad Pitt in the front. The Prop 71 would fund embryonic stem cell research in California. And so in November of 2007, about a year before we actually got the program off the ground, the plan for the Science and Entertainment Exchange was hatched. And most importantly, I left with a signed movie poster by Jerry Zucker, who said, "Barbara, if this is your favorite movie, you're really in trouble." So the Science and Entertainment Exchange is like 1-800-Scientists. So we're the hub. You know, we have a database of tens of thousands of scientists who not only are members of the academies, but they also work on our committees. And so we're a hub between that group and the entertainment community. And so if a writer, director, producer has a question about a storyline, wants to know what a set should look like, they call us and we figure out who we should set them up with. And we get them together either over the phone or in person. We also, if it's a big major film or a TV show and they need lots of different kinds of scientists, we put together a think tank for entire creative Hollywood teams. Kind of coincidentally for this actual slide here is that we've done 800 consults in the last 5 years. And we've done that in a way that I think George Gerber would be very happy with us. because we are in constant liaison with the entertainment community. And we're in constant liaison because we have an LA office. You know, the National Committee of Sciences is in DC, but we have an LA office where four of these people are our staff. The guy in the middle is one of our science consultants from Harvard. But the other four basically work full-time on this project. So let me give you some very quick just examples of some of our matchmaking skills. So for TV, we recently matched Gideon Mann from Google to Person of Interest. I actually got to work on this one myself. I don't usually work on this program, in the consults, but early on I was taking some calls. And so Dave Bardis, the showrunner for Covert Affairs, called me and asked me if I could set him up with somebody who knew something about radiation and radiation poisoning. And so I knew Kevin Crowley and set them up. And then there was a whole episode on that, and it was accurate. Then, for example, we did some work with Castle. We also do a lot of film consults. And the three films that we're working on now that my staff, the staff you saw in that picture, wanted me to mention, is Terminator 5, and these two people are science consulting on that. Big Hero 6 and Pirates 5. Didn't go, there we go. So in addition to the consultations, we also hold events. And we hold events because we want to spur ideas among the Hollywood community to make entire TV episodes around science rather than just answering individual questions. We've been doing this since the very beginning. We've held scores of these kinds of events. One of the typical formats is we'll have two phenomenal science communicators come into a small, maybe 40 people group of Hollywood, writers, directors, producers. They'll talk for 15 minutes each, and there'll be conversations for 2-3 more hours, and at midnight we have to throw them out of whatever home we're in at that time. We also do film screenings and have panels talk about the film and the science in the film, a good way to explain that. And so some of the events that we've done recently, well, the one of them that I do want to mention is the Science of Psychopaths that we did in New York. So we do Hollywood and New York as well. And that was in conjunction with a Tribeca Film Institute, and they've just told us last week that 3 script ideas have come in based on that science event. One of the recent events that we did was called the Science of Love, and of course this was over Valentine's Day. This is Chris McKinley, and he spoke. He's the guy who hacked into OkCupid because he wanted to he's a mathematician. He wanted to use his own data mining to find his fiancée, and this is a picture of him with his new fiancée. We're also going to do the physics and engineering of NASCAR, and that happens next Friday. We'll take about 20 writers, directors, or producers to NASCAR to learn about the physics and engineering. And then we'll have another event where they'll actually be at a race, and then another event where they actually get to ride in a car. We're doing Google Tours now because Google gave us a major grant in order to increase computer science content in film and TV, and also to make the portrayals of computer scientists more positive. And then we're developing a new kind of event called a pitch slam, where we've gotten some funding where we can team a scientist and a writer together over a weekend to come up with script ideas and then compete to actually get the TV show or the film made. So where has this gotten all of us? Well, I want to tell you about 2 different outcomes. We have many outcomes, but I really only have time to tell you 2. And the first one is an unexpected outcome. And I need to take you back to the beginning of the Science and Entertainment Exchange to really explain what happened. So we did a major event, a Hollywood extravaganza, to launch this program. And in fact, that was so successful that we haven't had to advertise at all ever since then. So we had 6 major science communicators and science communicators, including Neil deGrasse Tyson, as we see here, speak for 12 minutes. Then they were flanked with 2 scientists who were in their same field. They went off and did workshops. We had 300 Hollywood people there. They stayed the whole time. We were told by Hollywood that nobody's going to stay there the whole time, but they did. They loved the science. And it was hosted by celebrity host Seth MacFarlane of Family Guy fame. One of the interesting things that I found early on, now before I even knew anything about Family Guy, was that he's incredibly passionate about science. We decided that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Seth MacFarlane needed to meet. So my colleague Ann Merchant and I decided to go over to the table where Neil was sitting. And he looks really calm here, right? He's talking to Shirley Malcolm, you know, but by the time we got over to him, he was holding court. This is more typical Neil, of course. His arms were out, he was leaning back on his chair, he had yummy food all over his plate, so it's kind of hard to pull him away. But we did, we pulled him away, and we took him to a very quiet room where Seth MacFarlane was quietly sitting with chopsticks in hand eating sushi. So we thought, well, this is a real contrast, but you know, let's make sure they meet. So we left them together in that room and went off and managed the rest of the event. And you probably know where this story's going. And so at that time, Neil was working with Ann Druyan, who's Carl Sagan's widow, on a remake of Cosmos. And they were having trouble finding a network to invest the money into making it and then to actually, you know, airing it and distributing it. And so Seth and Neil, of course, met many times after we introduced them. And you know what happened. You know, the second episode of, there it is. The second episode of Cosmos will air tomorrow night on Fox. Because as you know, Seth is probably the highest paid guy in TV, and Fox has a lot of influence there. But he didn't really have to talk them into it. I think Fox really wanted to do this. And he just introduced Neil and Ann to the Fox executives. And you know, long story short, we now have Cosmos on Fox. And I think it's really important that it is on Fox because we're reaching so many more people. I mean, it's just a huge audience of people who wouldn't normally self-select into science we're reaching with this. And so we count this with, you know, this is a big story for one little introduction. But we're counting this as a major win for the science and entertainment exchange, but an even bigger win for humanity. So now, as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So I want to tell you about an expected outcome that we had. And so Sean M. Carroll is a physicist at Caltech. He's been consulting for us since the beginning. In fact, his wife was the first director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, first director of the office out in LA. He was working on the first movie, Thor, with Kenneth Branagh, who was the director. And they were talking about Jane Foster, who was the character in there played by Natalie Portman. And in the book, the graphic novel on which the movie is based, Jane Foster was a nurse. And Sean Carroll thought, well, you know what? I don't have anything against nurses, but we have plenty of women nurses. Why don't we make Natalie Portman, Jane Foster, a physicist? And he agreed. And so now we have this great role model, a physicist, on a major, major film. And I would think, really, that any 14-year-old girl would at least think about studying physics after seeing that film. And so we looked at the Twitter feed, and actually Dominic has done a lot of work on look at the Twitter tweet on Thor, and we can talk about that later. But we see some really positive tweets about Natalie Portman as a physicist. And then we also see some that tell us that we still have a lot of work to do. So these are just some anecdotal evidence of the Science and Entertainment Exchange outcomes in regard to getting more science in film and TV and getting more positive portrayals of scientists. But as I said at the beginning, I always come back, you know, to the science of science communication. And so have we really made a difference in film and TV, and have we changed attitudes? And I think that's an empirical question. And I call on any of the researchers here as in the social sciences to actually do some research on this so that we can go back and actually have a call to action to the researchers in the same way that George Gerber made a call to the scientific community to do what we did. Thank you.
In the early or middle 1980s, Neil Postman wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, about the values and approaches, methods of entertainment entering public discourse. And I know that your approach is a lot focused on personalizing science and scientists and exposure there. Upsides are often understood when projects start. What are there downsides to what you've done with working with the entertainment industry?
I'm not sure that I actually understand. Are there downsides to what we're doing?
Yeah, there often are unanticipated.
There could be some unanticipated consequences, I guess, and maybe you could say that those last 2 tweets made people think, well, there's no way that somebody that looks like Natalie Portman could ever be a physicist. And maybe that tweet then gets out and starts to, wreak havoc on that, but I sort of doubt it.
Okay.
But I understand your question.
Hi. Although the Big Bang Theory is making big waves in the image of scientists, do you think that it's possible to portray scientists as very cool and something that kids would really want to do, instead of the typical I'm a nerd and I like it a lot type of image?
I would love to see that, and I think you can do that and keep the story going and keep the tension going. And so they need to get a new friend, I think.
Yeah.
I will say that a very prominent scientist has said to me that he actually loves this show, and many scientists love this show, because he sees some of his colleagues in each one of those characters. But they're not all like that. All of them every one of them has problems with their mother, if you think about it. And they're quirky. Like I said, they're quirky, white, and male. Well, they're not all white, but yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you talked a lot about trying to change the the public's ideas towards scientists. But do you also, as part of your agenda with this exchange with Hollywood, do you also, are you trying to focus on the public's view of certain topics in science? Like, I'm involved in animal research, and there's a huge stigma against that, and stem cell research, and GMOs and all of that. Are you also maybe trying to change that in the public eye?
Absolutely, and the reason that I concentrated in this talk on scientists is because of Gerber's research, and it just sort of flowed into that very well and made a good point for part of what we're trying to do. But certainly with the events, for example, we would do events on, we did an event on evolution that Seth MacFarlane actually hosted for us. So we're trying to get those topics in there. We also did one on string theory, brain research, other environmental issues. So yes, we are certainly trying to do that as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the research of public opinion was from 1973 to 1983, but what's happened in between then and now? How has the public opinion changed towards scientists? And even in more recent years, you have more acceptance of different types of lifestyles and things like that are being portrayed on TV and the public's being more receptive of, and you're seeing a lot of change through that as well. So, I mean, is there a lot of change since then for that?
So in Anthony Dudo and Dominic Broussard's research, what they did find is that, what they didn't find was the negative outcome from heavy TV watchers. And they found some negative, attitudes towards science based on some different, partition segments of those TV watchers. But what they really said is that it's a much more complicated piece, and overall, their research showed more positivity towards science, but not, completely everything. Not everything was positive, and the depictions of scientists, the actual content analysis was very similar to Gerber's, but the attitude piece of it was a little bit different. Oh, sorry.
Hi. So do you only work with STEM fields, or do you do work with social science too? What about that in the entertainment industry?
We are certainly open to social science. Psychopaths certainly have some social science in there, so we did the science of psychopaths. So yes, we do that. I don't think that we've done a lot of events around social sciences, but we certainly do have social scientists as our consultants. We're not doing humanities and the arts, but they do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So, sorry, I'm going to bring the topic back to Big Bang Theory, the show, not the, the event. But anyway, and I was thinking, like, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the show, but whenever I really think about it, with the way nerd culture has kind of been taking off recently, and how it's kind of acceptable to have any sort of niche, like, interest, as opposed to how, like, the stereotypical nerd from, like, the 80s with the glasses and the getting shoved in lockers. And do you think that that has a very heavy impact on the way science is looked at? Because, I mean, while science and nerd culture aren't necessarily the same thing, there's a lot of overlap there. So.
But do you mean between the show and between that particular show and public attitudes?
Well, I mean, that show, it portrays, very socially awkward nerd scientists, but at the same time, nerd culture is way more accepted nowadays. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if, like, even though there are certain negative elements of how scientists are portrayed in that show, is it almost like, I don't know, with the better view on nerds now, could that almost be not as bad? I don't know.
Yeah, this is sort of like an economist on one hand and then on the other, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with that. Mm-hmm. And I don't personally have, I love that show personally. I think it's funny, so it's very entertaining. My favorite movie is Airplane, for God's sakes, so I think it's very funny. And so I think there's good things and bad things about the show, and the fact that it's a number 1 show, and they talk a lot about science. I mean, there is real science in there, and you have real science guest stars. You have Brian Greene, and he's not portrayed as a nerd. And you have Neil Tyson, who's a guest star. You have Stephen Hawking as a guest star. I can't even remember who else. You can tell I watch the show. But I think it's on one hand and the other. You have to really think about that. So anyway,
thank you.
That's my non-answer. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think it's great what you're doing with Hollywood to try and get the science right.
Thank you.
I'm curious though, is there anything that you guys do or that Hollywood does when the science is wrong? Like, I mean, is there any type of,
there are websites that just point out every single thing that's wrong in every single show. And we decided going in, based on some other scientific organizations who a long time ago got kicked out of Hollywood, that we would not be the accuracy police. And that the consultants that we choose know that. And so they are not walking in and saying, well, this has to be this way and this has to be this way. They're walking there and saying, well, for the storyline like this, if you just switched it a little bit like this, you could get the real science. And the real science is really stranger than fiction. And so, we're working that way. Otherwise, I think we would just be kicked right out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This might be a quick question, I'm not sure. About the consultants, I was just wondering, are they there for the entire filming process? Are they only there for the writing, or do they see the movie before it comes out to kind of error check that?
Yes. So it just depends. And not many consultants actually get a full-time gig. Kevin Grazier, has gotten many full-time gigs, but it's typically a phone call. That's most of it. To do 800 consults in 5 years, it's usually a phone call. Every now and then, the think tanks usually are like a whole day, where we'll fly scientists and engineers in from around the country, because we do use a lot of scientists at UCLA. If somebody wants to just see somebody in person for half an hour, but we really want to try to make this also interesting to the scientists and to give scientists around the country a chance to do this. And we're actually working on an evaluation now. We're evaluating the effects of this program on the science consultants. So hopefully we'll get that published.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you.